September 17, 1944, the skies above the Netherlands turned black with aircraft. More than 1,500 transport planes and gliders stretched across the horizon, carrying nearly 40,000 paratroopers into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. This was Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. A plan so audacious that if successful, it promised to end World War II by Christmas. But within 9 days, that promise would turn into one of the most controversial failures of the entire war. Thousands of Allied soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. An entire division would be nearly destroyed. And the bridge at Arnhem, the final objective, would become known forever as a bridge too far. This is the story of Operation Market Garden, a tale of extraordinary courage, fatal miscalculations, and the thin line between victory and disaster. By September 1944, the Allied forces had broken out from the beaches of Normandy and were racing across France. Paris had been liberated. The German army was in retreat. Optimism ran high through the Allied command. Many believed the war could be won before the year's end. But there was a problem. As the Allies pushed eastward, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every ration had to be trucked hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy. The rapid advance that had seemed like such a triumph was now becoming a logistical nightmare. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, favored a broad front strategy. He wanted to advance into Germany on multiple fronts, maintaining pressure across the entire line. But this approach meant spreading limited resources even thinner. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, had a different vision. Montgomery was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own strategic genius. He believed the Allies should concentrate all their resources on a single, powerful thrust into northern Germany, bypassing the heavily fortified Siegfried Line and capturing the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. If successful, this narrow thrust could reach Berlin and end the war in a matter of weeks. Montgomery's plan was called Operation Market Garden, and it was audacious in the extreme. The operation consisted of 2 parts. Market was the airborne component. 3.5 airborne divisions would drop from the sky and seize a series of bridges across the major rivers and canals of the Netherlands. Garden was the ground assault. The British, the 30th Corps, would race up a single highway, crossing each captured bridge in turn, until they reached the final objective, the bridge over the Rhine River at Arnhem, some 62 miles behind German lines. If everything went according to plan, the Allies would have a corridor into Germany itself. They would outflank the Siegfried Line. They would be positioned to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. The American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, would drop near Eindhoven, about 30 miles from the starting line. Their job was to capture the bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal and the Zuid-Willems Canal, and to secure the highway for the advancing ground forces. The American 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, had perhaps the most complex mission. They would land near Nijmegen, 53 miles from the start, with orders to capture the massive bridge over the Waal River and hold the strategically vital Groesbeek Heights on the German border. And finally, the British 1st Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, received the most distant and most dangerous objective of all. They would drop at Arnhem, 62 miles from friendly lines, and capture the bridge over the Lower Rhine. Once they held it, the 30th Corps would thunder across, and the road to Germany would be open. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect coordination, and perfect execution. The airborne forces would have to hold their positions, sometimes for days, against whatever German forces were in the area. The ground forces would have to advance at breakneck speed up a single highway, vulnerable to German counterattacks from both flanks. When Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of the British, the 1st Airborne Corps, saw the plan, he expressed concern. Looking at the map at the bridge at Arnhem so far from help, he reportedly said, "I think we might be going a bridge too far." He was right. But the operation was already in motion. Eisenhower gave his approval on September 10th. Montgomery had less than a week to prepare for the largest airborne operation in history. The short planning time was intentional, designed to take advantage of German disorganization. But it also meant cutting corners, ignoring warning signs, and hoping that audacity could overcome preparation. The Allied intelligence reports were deeply troubling. Dutch resistance fighters reported the presence of German armored units near Arnhem. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed what appeared to be tanks in the area, but senior commanders, including Browning and Montgomery, dismissed these reports. The Germans were beaten, they argued. Whatever units remained in the Netherlands would be second-rate troops, exhausted and demoralized. This would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. What the Allies didn't know was that the two SS Panzer Corps, including the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, were refitting in the Arnhem area. These were not demoralized stragglers. These were elite Waffen-SS units with experienced commanders, including Field Marshal Walter Model and SS Lieutenant General Wilhelm Bittrich. They had tanks, they had veteran soldiers, and they were about to get the fight of their lives? September 17, 1944 dawned clear and bright over England. At airbases across southern England, paratroopers made their final preparations. They checked their parachutes, loaded their weapons, and wrote last letters home. Many of them had been training for months, watching operation after operation canceled as Allied ground forces overran the intended drop zones. This time they were finally going. At 9:45 a.m., the first aircraft lifted into the sky. Soon, the air was filled with the roar of engines as more than 1,500 transport planes and gliders assembled into formations. It was the largest airborne armada ever assembled, and it stretched for miles across the sky. The Dutch civilians who watched the aircraft pass overhead were filled with hope. Liberation was coming. After 4 years of Nazi occupation, after hunger and oppression and fear, the Allies were finally here. People ran into the streets, waving and cheering as the aircraft roared past. The American 101st Airborne Division landed near the towns of Vigel and Zaan, just north of Eindhoven. The drop was remarkably successful. Within hours, the Screaming Eagles had secured most of their objectives. The bridge at Zaan was blown up by German defenders before it could be captured, but engineers quickly constructed a Bailey Bridge to replace it. By the end of the first day, advance units of the 30th Corps had linked up with the 101st. The southern end of the corridor was secure. The 82nd Airborne Division faced tougher resistance near Nijmegen. The massive highway bridge over the Vaal River was the longest in Europe, and the Germans knew its strategic importance. The 82nd quickly captured the town of Grave and several smaller bridges, but Nijmegen itself remained in German hands. The paratroopers dug in and prepared for a fight. At Arnhem, everything began to go wrong almost immediately. The British 1st Airborne Division's landing zones were chosen based on the advice of the RAF, who insisted that landing closer to the bridges would expose the transport aircraft to German anti-aircraft fire. As a result, the British paratroopers landed 7 miles west of their objective, the bridge at Arnhem. 7 miles through enemy-held territory. 7 miles that would have to be covered on foot. The plan called for a coup de main force, mounted in jeeps, to race ahead and seize the bridge before the Germans could react. But most of the jeeps and their anti-tank guns landed by glider on the second day. The reconnaissance squadron that was supposed to lead the charge found their jeeps either damaged or missing. Only one battalion, the 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to fight its way through to the bridge. They arrived at the northern end around 8 p.m. on the first day and immediately fortified the nearby buildings. Frost had roughly 700 men. He expected the rest of the division to arrive soon. He expected the 30th Corps to arrive within 48 hours. Neither would make it. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division ran into a nightmare. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions reacted with shocking speed. Field Marshal Model's headquarters was actually in Arnhem when the British landed, and within hours, German armored units were moving to block every route into the city. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne Division, quickly lost control of the battle. His radio equipment, which had been problematic from the start, failed almost completely in Arnhem's wooded terrain. Units couldn't communicate with each other or with headquarters. Urquhart himself spent 36 critical hours cut off from his command, hiding in an attic to avoid German patrols. Without communications, without clear orders, The British and Polish paratroopers fought with extraordinary courage but little coordination. They were squeezed into a shrinking perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem. They held out, waiting for the 30th Corps to arrive, but the 30th Corps was having problems of its own. The garden portion of Operation Market Garden was led by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, a capable and aggressive commander. The 30th Corps was spearheaded by the Guards Armored Division, one of the finest units in the British Army. Behind them stretched a column of tanks, trucks, and infantry that extended for miles. But they had to advance up a single highway elevated above the low-lying Dutch countryside. The road was so narrow that vehicles could barely pass. On either side lay soft ground and drainage ditches that made maneuver nearly impossible. It was, in the words of one officer, a death trap. The advance began at 2:35 p.m. on September 17th with a massive artillery barrage. Then the tanks rolled forward. Almost immediately they ran into trouble. German forces had fortified the highway with anti-tank guns and infantry. The leading tanks were hit and destroyed, blocking the road. It took hours to clear the wreckage and resume the advance. Every mile was contested. Every village had to be fought for. The grand vision of a lightning thrust to Arnhem was turning into a grinding, bloody slog. The Guards Armored Division reached the 101st Airborne's positions near Eindhoven by late afternoon on September 18th, a full day behind schedule. They pushed on toward Nijmegen, but German counterattacks kept cutting the highway behind them. Precious hours were lost clearing the road and bringing up supplies. At Nijmegen, the situation was desperate. The 82nd Airborne had been trying to capture the massive highway bridge for 2 days, but German defenders were too well entrenched. The city had become a brutal house-to-house battle. On September 20th, Brigadier General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne, made a bold decision. If they couldn't take the bridge by direct assault, they would cross the Vaal River by boat and attack from the rear. It was one of the most daring operations of the war. At 3 p.m., troops from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment climbed into canvas assault boats and paddled across the Vaal under withering German fire. The river was 400 yards wide. The boats had no armor. Many soldiers couldn't swim. German machine guns and artillery raked the water, turning it into a killing ground. But they made it. Against all odds, the American paratroopers reached the far shore, fought their way inland, and attacked the German defenders from behind. By nightfall, the Nijmegen Bridge was in Allied hands. The road to Arnhem was open. Only 11 miles remained, but those 11 miles might as well have been 100. At the bridge in Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his men were fighting for their lives. They had held the northern end of the bridge for 3 days and 3 nights, repelling attack after attack by German infantry, armor, and even flame-throwing vehicles. The houses around the bridge became fortresses, each room a separate battle. The British paratroopers fought from the ruins, taking terrible casualties but never surrendering. Frost himself was wounded on September 20th. Ammunition was running desperately low. Food and water were nearly gone. The wounded filled every cellar and basement with no medical supplies to treat them. Still, they held. They could hear the sounds of battle to the west, where the rest of the division was fighting around Oosterbeek. They watched for any sign of the 30th Corps approaching from the south, but no help came. The Germans brought up tanks and self-propelled guns to blast the British positions at point-blank range. They set buildings on fire to burn out the defenders. They attacked again and again, taking heavy losses but slowly, methodically, crushing the British paratroopers. On the morning of September 21st, after 4 days of continuous combat, the last defenders at the bridge were finally overwhelmed. Those who could still walk were taken prisoner. John Frost, wounded and exhausted, was among them. The bridge at Arnhem, the prize that was supposed to open the road to Germany, remained in German hands. Meanwhile, at Oosterbeek, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division was surrounded. Nearly 10,000 men were compressed into a shrinking perimeter less than a mile wide. They called it the Cauldron, and it was hell on earth. German artillery pounded the British positions day and night. Snipers picked off anyone who showed themselves. Supplies dropped by air usually fell into German hands. The wounded lay in aid stations with no morphine, no anesthesia, nothing but the courage of overworked medics to comfort them. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by Major General Stanisław Zabobski, finally arrived on September 21st, but they dropped on the wrong side of the Rhine, unable to reach the main British force. Attempts to cross the river failed with heavy losses. At Nijmegen, the 30th Corps tried to push the final 11 miles to Arnhem, but the road was under constant attack. German forces, reinforced and reorganized, fought fiercely for every yard. The single highway that was supposed to be the route to victory had become a corridor of death. On September 22nd, the 43rd Wessex Division attempted to reach the beleaguered paratroopers by crossing the Rhine west of Arnhem. A few dozen men made it across in boats, but they were too few, too late. The river crossing sites were under heavy fire. The plan was abandoned. Inside the Oosterbeek perimeter, the situation was hopeless. The men were starving, exhausted, out of ammunition. They had held out for days beyond what anyone thought possible, waiting for relief that would never come. On September 25th, the order finally came to withdraw. The evacuation of the survivors from Arnhem was codenamed Operation Berlin, and it took place on the night of September 25th to 26th, under cover of darkness and rain. The plan was desperate in its simplicity. The men would move silently to the riverbank, where boats from the 30th Corps would ferry them across the Rhine. They would have to move without lights, without noise, leaving their wounded behind. The Germans could not know what was happening, or they would slaughter the retreating forces. The paratroopers wrapped their boots in cloth to muffle their footsteps. They left their equipment behind. They carried their wounded comrades as far as they could, then had to make the agonizing decision to leave them for German medical care. Through the rain and darkness, they made their way to the river. Some boats had been destroyed by German fire. Others were swept away by the current. Men waded into the cold water, some clinging to debris, others trying to swim across in their uniforms. Of the nearly 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne Division and Polish Brigade who had dropped at Arnhem, only about 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. Another 1,500 were dead. More than 6,000 were wounded or captured. The Guards Armored Division and other the 30th Corps units held the southern bank, providing covering fire as their comrades escaped. But there was no denying the reality. Operation Market Garden had failed. The American divisions had performed magnificently. The 101st and 82nd Airborne had achieved nearly all their objectives, holding the corridor open against repeated German counterattacks. They had fought with skill and courage, and their casualties, while significant, were far lower than the British at Arnhem. But the grand strategic objective, crossing the Rhine and opening the road to Germany, was lost. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The war would not be over by Christmas. The Allies would have to fight their way into Germany through the winter, culminating in bloody campaigns like the Battle of the Bulge and the crossing of the Rhine at Remagen. In the immediate aftermath of Market Garden, the recriminations began. Who was to blame for the failure? Montgomery typically refused to accept responsibility. He claimed the operation was 90% successful, pointing to the liberation of large parts of the Netherlands and the creation of a salient into German territory. He argued that with proper support the operation could have succeeded. Others saw it differently. Historians and military analysts have spent decades dissecting what went wrong. The intelligence failures were catastrophic. The presence of two SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem was known before the operation began, but commanders chose to ignore or downplay the reports. The assumption that German forces would be weak and demoralized proved tragically wrong. The planning was rushed and inadequate. 7 days to prepare the largest airborne operation in history was simply not enough time. Detailed reconnaissance was lacking. Contingency plans were insufficient. The decision to land the British forces 7 miles from their objective at Arnhem was a fatal error. The communications equipment failed almost completely, particularly in the wooded terrain around Arnhem. Units couldn't coordinate with each other. Urquhart lost control of his division at the crucial moment. Requests for air support and resupply went unheard. The shortage of transport aircraft meant that the airborne forces had to be delivered in 3 separate lifts over 3 days, rather than all at once. This gave the Germans time to react and reinforce their defenses. It meant that reinforcements arrived piecemeal, unable to support the initial assault. The single highway advance of the 30th Corps was tactically foolish. The road was too narrow, too easily blocked, too vulnerable to counterattack. When German forces cut the highway, which they did repeatedly, the entire advance ground to a halt while engineers cleared the obstacles and fighting reopened the route. And perhaps most fundamentally, the strategic concept itself was flawed. The narrow thrust strategy that Montgomery advocated required everything to go right. It had no margin for error. When things went wrong, as they inevitably do in war, there was no backup plan. But amidst all the analysis of failure, one thing stands out: the extraordinary courage and determination of the soldiers who fought at Arnhem. The British and Polish paratroopers at Oosterbeek held out for 9 days against overwhelming odds. They fought without adequate supplies, without air support, without hope of relief. They endured artillery bombardment, tank attacks, and constant infantry assaults. And they never broke. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his men held the bridge for 4 days with 700 soldiers against an entire SS Panzer division. When ammunition ran out, they fought with captured German weapons. When the buildings were set on fire, they fought from the ruins. When they were finally overwhelmed, they had inflicted casualties many times their own number. The American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne fought with equal valor. The river crossing at Nijmegen, paddling across the Vaal in canvas boats under withering fire, ranks among the most courageous actions of the entire war. The Dutch civilians who lived through the battle paid a terrible price. Arnhem was devastated by the fighting. Thousands were made homeless. The German reprisals against suspected resistance members were brutal. And in the hunger winter that followed, when the Germans deliberately cut off food supplies to Western Holland in retaliation for the Dutch railway workers' strike that supported Market Garden, more than 20,000 Dutch civilians died of starvation. Operation Market Garden remains one of the most controversial operations of World War II. It was a gamble, a bold stroke that promised to end the war months early and save countless lives. When it failed, it cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers and condemned Europe to months more of warfare and suffering. Could it have succeeded? Some historians argue yes, that with better intelligence, better planning, and better luck, the bridge at Arnhem could have been taken and held. Others contend the operation was doomed from the start, that the strategic concept was fundamentally flawed and no amount of courage could overcome its inherent weaknesses. What is certain is that the men who fought at Arnhem, at Nijmegen, at Eindhoven, and along the highway corridor displayed extraordinary heroism. They were asked to achieve the nearly impossible, and they came heartbreakingly close to succeeding. The bridge at Arnhem was later renamed the John Frost Bridge, in honor of the lieutenant colonel who held it for 4 days against all odds. Today, it stands as a memorial to the men who fought there, a reminder of both the courage and the tragedy of Operation Market Garden. Every September, the Dutch people commemorate the battle. They hold ceremonies at the memorials. They teach their children about the liberation. They have never forgotten the soldiers who came to free them, and who paid such a terrible price in the attempt. Because in the end, Operation Market Garden was more than just a military operation. It was a testament to human courage, to the willingness of soldiers to fight against impossible odds for a cause they believed in. It was a reminder that even in failure, there can be honor. Even in defeat, there can be glory. The bridge at Arnhem was a bridge too far, but the men who fought to take it were heroes, everyone.